سورة المباركة الفاتحة. بسم الله. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الغوي الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين وبه نستعين وهو خير الناصرين، ثم الصلاة والسلام وتحيته والإكرام على سيدنا ونبينا وحبيب قلوبنا وشفيع لذنوبنا وطبيب نفوسنا أبا القاسم محمد وآله الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين المظلومين، ولعنة الله على أعدائهم أجمعين إلى قيام يوم الدين. وفقنا الله وإياكم بعلم وعمل صالح إن شاء الله. قال الله عز وجل في كتابه الكريم وقوله الحق: بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الذي يوسوس في صدور الناس من الجنة والناس. آمنا به. صدق الله العلي العظيم. صلوا على محمد وآل محمد. Elders, brothers and sisters, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. The concept of shaitan, or this idea of shaitan, the devil or the Satan, mentioned in the Holy Quran is something that is recurrent. It's a theme that's mentioned repeatedly throughout the Holy Quran. And the reason why it's repeated in the Holy Quran is so that we pay attention to it, so that we at least spend some time discussing the reality of shaitan. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Holy Quran, when He repeats a particular notion or a concept, it's not out of entertainment that He repeats that particular concept. When I repeat something, for example, it's foolish for me to repeat something without any hadaf, without any purpose, let alone Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Sometimes we ask the questions that many of the stories mentioned in the Holy Quran are repetitive. The reason why it's repetitive is because there is some deep meaning behind it that we need to pay attention over. When the Quran, for example, Allah tells us and orders us to do tafakkur and tadabbur, these stories are one of the prime examples of what we should focus our attention on and try and think over them and ponder over them. The concept of shaitan is being one of them, that it's a recurrent theme mentioned throughout the Holy Quran from the beginning until the very end. And what the Holy Quran does, what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does with regards to this concept of shaitan or the shayateen, is that He begins in some of the verses, He begins to identify the identity of shaitan. He begins to pinpoint what exactly is shaitan, what are his attributes, what are his akhlaq, how does he approach mankind, how does he affect mankind, how does he misguide mankind. All of these are mentioned within the Holy Quran. So for example, when you refer to one verse, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, very famous verse, إِنَّهُ لَكُمْ عَدُوٌ مُبِينٌ, that he is considered to be an open enemy, a manifest enemy. So when you ask the question, shaitan being a manifest enemy, what does that mean? It means that shaitan has taken on the responsibility to misguide mankind as much as possible. In fact, he vows this to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He makes a promise to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that I will misguide mankind and I will take majority of them with me towards the path of failure, towards the path of destruction and annihilation. I am taking on that responsibility. When you look at another verse, for example, in the Holy Quran, very famous verse again, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that we cannot see the shayateen, but the shayateen can see us. إِنَّهُ يَرَاكُمْ هُوَ وَقَبِيلُهُ مِنْ حَيْثُ لَا تَرَوْنَهُمْ, that he can see us, but we cannot see him. So this identity of shaitan is what? That he is invisible, he cannot be seen. He can see us, but we cannot see him. Amongst the discussions of the scholars, this triggered a very famous discussion amongst the scholars. The scholars asked the question. They said if shaitan is number one, invisible, and number two, he's considered to be an open enemy, then how does he misguide mankind? If you look into the world today, we can safely say that majority of the people in the world are misguided by shaitan. As in, what is the criteria of misguidance? Misguidance, according to the Islamic thought, according to Islamic teachings, is when a person allows his desires to manipulate his lifestyle. That my desires and my anger, for example, are the things which allows me to live. Whereas a person who is successful in dunya is a person who allows his aql to guide him in his lifestyle. And of course, this is what makes up our personality of our nafs. When you say this person has a good nafs or this person has a bad nafs, the criteria behind a good nafs or a bad nafs is when a person allows his aql to guide him is a good person. When a person allows his desires to guide him in his lifestyle is a bad person. So how can we say that shaitan, number one, being an open enemy of mankind, and number two, being invisible, how does he affect mankind? So the answer that came from the scholars was that one of the greatest strategies of shaitan al-la'in was known as waswasa or waswas. We've heard this before. Waswasa is what is known as whisperings in the English language. But according to the Quranic language, the Holy Quran explains that waswasa is not something that's just limited to whisperings. Waswasa is an indication of the weakest form of communication that takes place between two individuals. I can either shout or I can speak normally, but when I whisper to someone, it is the weakest, it is the softest, it is the most hidden way of communication between two personalities or between two people. This is how shaitan interacts with us. This is exactly how shaitan interacts with mankind. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. Before I move on with the discussion, there's an important point to be made. When we say that number one, shaitan's identity consists that he is invisible, and shaitan's identity consists that he cannot be seen, and number two, he considers human beings to be his worst enemies, then the question is raised, why is it that shaitan, Sallu ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad, a concept was raised amongst the ulama and their understandings and their examination of this particular issue. They said if shaitan number one is invisible and shaitan considers human beings to be his greatest enemies, then does this not trigger our minds? Does this not catch our attention, to say the least? As in, when you look at two human beings who are considered to be enemies, these two human beings will do whatever it takes to try and understand his enemy's strategies. He will do whatever it takes to try and understand his enemy's, not only his strategies, but his resources that can be potentially damaging to me in my life. If you look at two countries who are at war with one another, each country, what do? They send spies, yes? One country sends spies to the others, the other reciprocates to try and find out what resources they have, to try and find out what secrets they have, so that one country can always have the upper hand against the other country. If we consider shaitan to be our open enemy, and shaitan has declared this within the Holy Quran, does it not behoove us to actually sit back and try and understand what is it that makes shaitan our enemy? What is his strategy? To try and understand how he uses his strategy to affect us in our life, how he tries to misguide us and take us away from Sirat al-Mustaqim to Sirat al-Dhalin. So when you look at the Holy Quran, the Quran indicates الَّذِي يُوَسْوِسُ فِي صُدُورِ النَّاسِ, that shaitan's greatest strategy is the strategy of whispering, waswasa. As in, there are many different manifestations of waswasa, know you. There's not just one area where shaitan focuses on. There are many different manifestations and many different areas that shaitan focuses on. For example, in one ayah of the Holy Quran, الشَّيْطَانُ يَعِدُكُمُ الْفَاقِرِ, that shaitan threatens human beings with poverty. That when a man or when a person is about to give sadaqah, when he's about to give charity, guaranteed shaitan is standing next to you trying to deter you from giving charity. This is shaitan's strategy. If you're about to give a fiver or for example 50 pounds, shaitan will do whatever it takes in his capacity, in his ability to deter you from giving that mablagh, to give that money. he will make it sound as if your entire life depends on that note. He will make sure and say to you and convince you that you will be a victim of poverty if you were to give this particular amount of money. When we do give charity, and of course when you refer to the riwayat of charity, they say that it is the greatest, the most heaviest weapon against shaitan, to give charity. When a person gives charity, it breaks shaitan's back. Why? Because of that level of empathy. When we are empathetic towards others, when we know that others are in need and we give what we love, which is wealth and mal, it breaks shaitan's back. Because I'm now engaging, I'm actively engaging in looking after the people in my community or the people in the world, for example. So when a person gives charity, it breaks shaitan's back. Sometimes shaitan comes after a person gives charity. Sometimes when I give money, shaitan will say to me, maybe you gave too much. It happens to some of us, yes? When we give £5 or £10, we always have this second thought that maybe perhaps I gave too much, more than what was needed. Maybe next time I'll give fewer. So shaitan, when it comes to charity, makes sure that he attacks the human being in a way that he threatens the human being through poverty. Another way, for example, how shaitan affects the human being is not through charity, but it's through ibadah. And sometimes we see this within our ahkam al-shari'i. When we perform wudu, when we recite salah, when we perform, for example, salat al-layl and so on and so forth, shaitan affects us how? Through waswasa, isn't it? We call this what in ahkam? Kathrat al-shak. When a person has a lot of shak in his ibadah. And the idea behind this is when a person, for example, is performing wudu, he needs to, by necessity, he needs to wash his hands 30, 40 times before moving on to the other hand. He needs to wash his face 50 times before moving on to his hands. And the idea behind this is that shaitan will make sure that that form of ibadah becomes heavy on you. And when it becomes heavy on you, you think twice before doing it again. When you stand to recite Salat al-Fajr, for example, Salat al-Fajr may take you half an hour. You start, you break, you start, you break, you start, you break. You perform wudu 3-4 times in between. And then when you start again, you break it again. It takes you half an hour to recite Salat al-Fajr. To the extent that the next day or the next day after that, when you are ready to recite Salat al-Fajr, you'll think twice. It becomes so heavy on you. Basic ibadah becomes so heavy on you, it deters you from performing that a'mal. At times, shaitan affects the human being through his aqidah. If a person, for example, does not have a strong theological belief, his creed is not strong, his information, his mindset is not strong, shaitan will affect you with the most silliest of questions sometimes. How many people are leaving the religion of Islam over the most silliest of issues? Islam, for example, you find Muslims, you go on YouTube, you look at all of these people who have now become, they boast about how being murtads. Yes, they have that audacity to say, I'm a murtad now, what are you going to do? What are you going to do? Are you going to kill me? The Quran orders you to kill me. You find that audacity being there by the people trying to challenge the Muslim community that I have left Islam and I have liberated myself from the Sharia of the religion of Islam. At times when you listen to the excuse of why they left the religion of Islam, it's mostly emotional, it's never academic. When there is a person who leaves the religion of Islam through academic means, then we can discuss and sit and discuss. But when usually you find people leaving the religion of Islam through emotional needs. At times you find that shaitan affects the human being through ibadah and through our aqidah as well. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. At times you find at times shaitan affects the human being through tazyin al-a'mal. What's tazyin al-a'mal? Tazyin al-a'mal is when you're about to perform a sin. You know that it's a sin. You know it's defiance against the Sharia of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But shaitan will try and beautify that action for you. Shaitan will do whatever it takes for you to commit that particular action. So for example, when you're sitting there behind the screen doing whatever you're doing or listening to something or watching certain things you're not supposed to, shaitan will come and say to you, well, it's just a one-time thing. Why don't you carry on? And all of a sudden, the next thing you know, hours have gone by. This is what is known as tazyin al-a'mal. As I like to say, that shaitan loves or shaitan has this ability to beautify garbage for you. In reality, a sin is something disgusting. When you ask the imams of the Ahlul Bayt and they were asked this, we believe in their infallibility. When they were asked, why is it that you are infallible? Can you commit a sin? They said, yes, we can commit sins, but we choose not to. What does that mean, we choose not to? The Imam alayhi salam in one narration explains, he says that we see the reality of sins. We'll discuss this in one of the lectures. He says we see the reality of sins, and it's so abhorrent and it's so disgusting for us that we repel ourselves from committing that sin. A sin in its entire, in its nature, in its innate nature, is something abhorrent, but we perform them anyways because shaitan has this ability to beautify that sin for us. So you have, these are the different manifestations of what is known as waswasat shaitan. Now a question was raised by the ulama, and it's a beautiful question. They say, how does waswasat shaitan take place? If shaitan is number one, invisible, and shaitan number two is considered to be our open enemy, how does he misguide us through waswasa? In fact, some of the scholars, the minority of them, very minority of them, they came forward and they said that shaitan aslan doesn't exist. The way we interpret shaitan, the way the Quran interprets shaitan, it doesn't exist. Shaitan is a manifestation of our innate desires. That's all it is. Of course, this opinion is rejected. Majority of the scholars rejected this opinion. But this opinion stemmed out of from where? The reason, because shaitan is number one, invisible. If shaitan is invisible, how does it communicate with us? Whispering, waswasa, is a physical form of communication. But when it comes to shaitan, shaitan doesn't communicate with us physically. Because he doesn't communicate with us physically, it means that there is no shaitan. Shaitan aslan is considered to be our innate desires, our desires that pull us towards evil, that push us towards evil. That's what's known as shaitan. Majority of our scholars came forward and said this opinion is completely rejected. Why? Because what you're doing here is you're taking shaitan and you're carrying it not on its literal meaning, but you're carrying it in its metaphorical meaning. When you refer to the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala begins to discuss the history of shaitan, his interaction with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, for example, his interaction with Nabi Adam alayhi salam. When you refer to the riwayat of the Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam, Allahumma salli ala. Some of these riwayats begin to indicate, or they begin to indicate the interactions of shaitan with Nabi Nuh alayhi salam, with Nabi Musa alayhi salam, Nabi Isa alayhi salam, Nabi Ibrahim in Hajj, for example. The manifestations of Hajj, one of the manifestations of Hajj was the interactions between shaitan and Nabi Ibrahim. His interactions with the Imams, his interaction with Rasulullah. When you take all of this and you put it together, you come to the understanding that shaitan was actually a living being. Kana min al-jinn. He is actually a living being, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala granted him life until ila waqtin ma'lum, towards that time which is only known by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But this minority, they came forward and they said, no, this literal meaning of shaitan doesn't hold for us. In fact, shaitan means our innate desires. So they carried the word shaitan according to its metaphorical meaning. And one of the arguments to refute this particular ideology was to say that, number one, in language, any language, every form of language is considered to be literal until there is evidence to show that it is metaphorical. As long as there is no evidence to show it's metaphorical, it's literal. So whenever shaitan appears within the Holy Quran and within the riwayat, it indicates an actual living being. So the question still stands. How does shaitan interact with us through waswasa? How does shaitan misguide me through waswasa? Here the ulama came forward and explained this beautifully. They said that when you look at the nafs of the human being, and the nafs is something that exists. We're not just physical human beings, we are physical and non-material as well. The non-material is known as nafs. Please pay attention to this point. They said, the ulama explained that the nafs of the human being is made up of 4 faculties, of 4 powers. The first is known as the faculty of reason. The power of reasoning, the power of the aql. The second is known as the power of desire. The third is known as the power of anger. The fourth is known as the power of imagination. What's the power of reasoning? The power of reasoning is when I use my aql to differentiate what is good from bad. There's a particular action. Is this action good or bad? My aql differentiates whether it's good or bad. In fact, the best of human beings are those who use their aql to always choose good and overpower bad. The second is the power of anger. Anger in itself is a good thing. It's not an evil trait. Only when it is misused, it becomes evil. But in itself is good. If I use my anger and I use it against my family, against my wife, against my children, against my people, my friends and my families, it becomes bad. When I allow anger to control me in my life, it is a bad thing. But in itself, it's good. When I defend myself when necessary. When my family is under attack, I use anger to defend my family. This is a good thing. Sometimes I use anger to try and show people that they are wrong and that they need to fix themselves. Otherwise, the community is in jeopardy sometimes. Yes, anger is a good thing in itself. We come to the third faculty, the faculty of desire. Again, desires in itself are good. You find, for example, the human being, the reason why we exist today is because of our desires. Procreation, for example, allows us to live. Eating and drinking is a form of desires that allows us to sustain ourselves on a daily basis. Desires in itself are good, but when they are not channeled according to the Sharia, it can become something vicious and it can destroy us from within. It can bring about qaswat al-qalb, which is, I think, the discussion tomorrow, inshallah. The fourth faculty is the faculty known as imagination. Now, the scholars came here and explained that imagination is not like the other three faculties. It's not like the aql, it's not like desires, and it's not like the anger. The imagination is a power, but it's a tool, it's an instrument. It's a tool and an instrument that allows me to behave according to my reasoning, or it's an instrument that allows me to behave according to my desires, or it's an instrument that allows me to behave according to my anger. It's an instrument and nothing more. So let me give you an example. There's a particular action that I want to perform. My aql tells me it's a good action. For example, ibadah. I want to recite Salat al-Layl. It's a beautiful action in the eyes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. My imagination then steps in. It then plans out all of my actions for Salat al-Layl. It joins my aql and it brings about the action itself. So the imagination is a tool that allows me to behave and bring about that action. Let's talk about desires, for example. I'm fasting, we're all starving. Tonight is what? Barbecue night, huh? Yeah, I can see the smiles. Nurun ala nur. Tonight is barbecue night. We all have the appetite for that particular time. So I'm now using my imagination. I'm now planning out my events. That planning, that imagination will then join with my desires and it will make me eat that particular type of food. So imagination is nothing but a tool and an instrument that allows me to perform the action. The ulama then explained, they said that shaitan, when it comes to waswasa, shaitan has no effect in my intellect, in my aql. Shaitan has no effect and no interactions with my desires. Shaitan has no interactions with my anger. Shaitan has an impact and an interaction with my imagination. All it takes is one word to be implanted in my mind. That word will then develop itself. It will build up to an intention. When it becomes an intention, it then builds up and it builds up and it builds up until it becomes an action. When I perform that action, it stems back from that one word that was implanted in my mind. That's why the Holy Quran, what does it say? It says that this power of waswasa is not limited to just the shayateen. It's not limited to shaitan. It's limited to human beings as well. It's also applicable to human beings. الَّذِي يُوَسْوِسُ فِي صُدُورِ النَّاسِ مِنَ الْجِنَّةِ وَالنَّاسِ. From amongst the jinn and mankind. And I'm sure you've had this before, where you've had certain friends, certain not so good friends, they may say something, a word, and that word sticks into your mind and it evolves. It builds up to us, it builds up to something. Yes, they may persuade you to do something, they may convince you to do something that may not necessarily be halal. When it builds up, and that manifests itself into action. So when it comes to waswasa to shaitan affects my mind, my imagination. Shaitan doesn't affect my aql. He doesn't affect and doesn't interact with my desires, and he doesn't affect my anger, but he affects my imagination. There's a beautiful story, and it's mentioned in our books of our tafasir. It's the story of Barsisa. Barsisa, they say he was a monk, a sage, a saint of his time. They say Barsisa was one of the rabbis of his communities, and he was ma'aruf in his community, very well known to be a pious man, a man of God. They say one day 3 brothers came towards him and they said to him, Ya Barsisa, we have some work outside the city. We have some work outside the city. We have a sister. We can't take the sister with us. According to some narrations, they say they had to go for jihad. But whatever it may be, they had to go. They had some affairs outside the city, and they had to leave their sister with someone. They said, "We do not trust anyone in the city except for you. You are ma'ruf. You are known to be a man of God, a man of piety. Protect our sister until we come back." But Sisa, you know what his first reaction was? He said, "A'udhu billahi minash shaytanir rajim." Said, "I seek the protection of Allah from the accursed shaitan." He refused the offer. He said, "Find someone else." The brothers, they were saddened to hear this. They were saddened to hear his refusal, and they left. As they were leaving, they say Shaitan came and implanted a thought in his mind. Said, "Barsisa, come on. You're the best in the community. You're the most pious. If they give their sisters to someone else, imagine what that person would do to their sister. At least you know that this woman is safe under your protection." So they say, Barsisa, he turns to them. He says, "I take my refusal back. I'll look after your sister, no problem. But it's with the condition that she doesn't live with me in this property. I have another property which is not far from here. I will make her stay in that property and I'll look after her whilst she is in that property." They agreed. They said, "That's a beautiful idea, no problem whatsoever." They leave to tend for their affairs, and the sister is living in that property, that separate property, and he is living in his own home. They say every day he would cook his meal, or cook a meal for her. When he would prepare the meal for her, the food, he would come and he would place it outside his house, and then he would shout, "Ya fulana, your food is ready." So that woman would then come out of the house. She would come, pick up the food, and come and go back to her house, her property. A few days go by. They say that Shaitan then comes towards Barsisa and implants a thought in his mind. "Barsisa, come on. This woman is going through all of the hassle and the trouble to come pick up the food. Why don't you go to her and give the food to her? The people are watching of how you're interacting with this woman, that she has to leave her home, come, pick up the food, put on the hijab, and so on and so forth. Why don't you for one go and give her the food?" The next day, Barsisa decides that he will cook the food and he would go and give it to her. He goes the next day, he opens the door, he places the food inside the house, and he comes back. A few days go by like this. Then all of a sudden, Shaitan comes and implants a thought in his mind. He says, "Barsisa, come on. The brothers aren't back yet. It's been a while. I'm sure she has some hajat that needs to be tended for. Why don't you go and speak to her what her hajats are, if she needs any fruits, any vegetables, any groceries, whatnot. Go speak to her and find out what she needs." Barsisa decides. He says, "I'll go to the house, I'll speak with her, I'll sit with her, I'll talk with her. I'll see what hajats she has, and then I will tend to them." He goes the next day, he speaks with her, and this goes on for a few days, until a few days after, Shaitan comes and interacts with Barsisa again. He implants a thought in his mind. "Barsisa, she's lonely, she doesn't have anyone to talk to, she has no friends, she has no family. Go and give her some comfort, go and speak with her." They say Barsisa enters the house, he begins to sit with this woman, he begins to dialogue with this woman, free chit-chatting, yes, casual conversations. All of a sudden, it's free between her and it's free between him. And this carries on for a few days, it carries on for a few weeks. Until one night, he returns to his home. In the middle of the night, Shaitan approaches him and says to him, "Barsisa, what's wrong with you?" "Barsisa, come on, she's a beautiful woman." They say Barsisa made the decision, he got up, he went to his house, her property, and he did what he did. All of it, why? It stemmed from the imagination, the power of the imagination. The imagination is a tool that Shaitan attacks. And when he attacks it, that imagination changes and it manifests itself, it evolves to an intention. And when it evolves to an intention, it evolves to an action. And that action is, of course, defiance against Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. There is much to say on the topic, but that is enough for now, inshallah ta'ala. وآخر الدعوانا الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى اللهم على محمد وآله الطيبين الطاهرين.